All right, number one on the docket, Rick James. We're not just talking about a musician here. This dude was a full-blown hurricane of glitter, funk, and pure, uncut energy that just detonated on the scene, grabbed pop music by the collar, and pretty much forced it to get down to his electrifying beat. I mean, this was the self-crowned king of punk funk, the guy behind bangers like Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby, a totally charismatic, over-the-top superstar who was living life at 1,000 miles an hour. But, underneath all the jerry curls, sparkly jumpsuits, and number one hits, something pretty dark was brewing. It was powered by a bottomless appetite not just for fame, but for the destructive clutch of crack cocaine. It was an addiction that would flip the script, turning the musical mastermind into an absolute monster. This sent him spiraling down a rabbit hole of paranoia, violence, and eventually prison time that left everyone's jaws on the floor and put a permanent stain on the Rick James legacy. So, he was born James Ambrose Johnson Jr. in 1948, and from the get-go, Rick James's life was tangled up in music and breaking the rules. The guy went AWOL from the Navy Reserves, took off to Canada, and, get this, started a band with a couple of guys who would later become legends, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. He even did some time behind the scenes at Motown before finally blowing up in the late 1970s with his signature mix of funk, rock, and soul. His albums like Come Get It and Street Songs were absolute blockbusters, making him one of the biggest names of that whole decade. People knew him for his insane musical chops, his completely wild stage shows, and a lifestyle that was notoriously off the rails. We're talking sex, drugs, and rock and roll wasn't just a marketing slogan for this guy. It was his Tuesday. Cocaine, in particular, pretty much became his shadow. On one hand, it was gassing up his creativity, but on the other, it was sparking some dangerous paranoia and making him super unpredictable. By the late 1980s, his addiction kicked into high gear, shifting from powder cocaine to the cheaper, way more intense, and infinitely more destructive crack cocaine. This switch basically marked the beginning of a truly terrifying nosedive. So, how deep down the rabbit hole was he going to go? As his addiction got worse, his behavior just got more and more unhinged and violent. The musical whiz who created all those catchy beats was getting eaten alive by a paranoid, aggressive new personality. And the breaking point, the one event that would finally get him locked up and become the darkest chapter of his story, went down in July of 1991. James and his young girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, were holed up in his West Hollywood house, neck deep in a crack binge that had been going on for days, and were completely convinced that a 24-year-old woman named Frances Alley had ripped him off for some drugs or cash. So, James managed to lure her back to his place. And what happened next wasn't some little disagreement, it was hours of straight-up sadistic torture. Based on what came out in court, James and Hijazi held Alley prisoner for a few days. During that time, they beat her mercilessly. They repeatedly burned her with the business end of a crack pipe and a hot knife, resulting in severe third-degree burns. And they also coerced her into performing degrading sexual acts. Alley somehow managed to get away, completely battered and traumatized, and she went right to the cops. So, you'd think facing a mountain of charges would make a guy reconsider his life choices, right? Well, Rick James apparently didn't get the memo. Unbelievably, just a few weeks later, while he was out on bail for that first little incident, he and Hijazi decided to go for round two. This time, their target was a music executive named Mary Soger, who James had invited over to his hotel room, supposedly to talk business. Yeah, right. So when Soger wasn't interested in James's business proposal, or maybe just had the bad luck to be there when the party favors kicked in a little too hard, that signature rage just exploded all over again. James and Hijazi held the poor woman captive for almost 20 hours, putting her through a horrifying gauntlet of beatings and degrading humiliation before she finally broke free and called the cops. At this point, the pattern was becoming, let's say, painfully obvious. It was official. Rick James, completely fueled by his crack cocaine addiction, had gone full-blown predator, using brute force and sheer terror to get his way. The super freak had morphed into a super monster, and let's just say his real-life actions weren't vibing with the funky fun times in his music. Naturally, the court case that followed was a total media circus. The courtroom testimony from Frances Alley and Mary Soger was straight out of a horror movie, detailing a nightmarish world of drug-fueled cruelty and out-of-control violence. At first, James tried to deny everything, probably thinking his celebrity status was some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card, but the evidence against him was just too massive to ignore. I mean, it's hard to argue when the victims have the physical injuries to prove it. Looking at a potential life sentence for kidnapping and torture, he finally caved and took a plea deal. In 1993, Rick James was found guilty of assault and false imprisonment and his partner in crime, Tanya Hijazi, was convicted right alongside him. James got a sentence of 5 years and 4 months in California's infamous Folsom State Prison. So much for being the king of funk and a Grammy winner, huh? The multi-platinum superstar was suddenly just another guy in a jumpsuit, stripped of his celebrity status and his freedom, finally cashing the check his violent addiction had written. He ended up doing a little over 2 years and got out on parole in 1996. You'd think prison would have straightened him out, and for a minute there, it almost looked like it did. He did the whole public apology tour, talking about his addiction, saying how sorry he was, and trying to get his music career back on track. He even got a little boost in popularity when artists like MC Hammer started sampling his stuff. And who could forget that classic self-roasting appearance on Chappelle's show, where his famous line, "Cocaine is a hell of a drug," became the most ironic and widespread catchphrase ever. But, surprise, surprise, the old habits never really died. He kept wrestling with substance abuse and a whole laundry list of health issues for the rest of his days. He even kept getting into minor scrapes with the law after he got out. Rick James finally passed away in his sleep in August of 2004 from heart and lung failure. And get this, the coroner's report found 9 different drugs in his system, including, you guessed it, cocaine. His story is one for the books. A real, tragic, don't-do-this-at-home tale of incredible talent completely swallowed by addiction. This guy hit the absolute peak of pop stardom, making music that was the soundtrack for a whole generation, only to have his entire legacy forever tainted by the brutal crimes he committed, while high on crack crimes that took him on a one-way trip from the main stage to a jail cell. Now, if Rick James's downfall was a violent crack-fueled explosion, our next celebrity's crash and burn was more of a slow, public train wreck. This one was powered by heroin and the never-blinking eye of the British tabloids. Coming in at number 2, Boy George. Back in the glittery, synth-heavy world of 1980s pop music, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone as instantly iconic, visually stunning, or as adored by everyone as Boy George, with that signature androgynous style, his smooth, soulful voice, and a serious thing for over-the-top hats. He took Culture Club to the very top of the global charts. Tunes like Do You Really Want to Hurt Me and Karma Chameleon weren't just pop songs. They were cultural milestones that basically defined the entire look and sound of the new romantic movement. He was MTV's favorite gender-bending, rule-breaking icon, famous for his sharp wit, his undeniable charm, and what everyone thought was just some harmless quirkiness. But hiding behind all that makeup and those catchy tunes, a nasty little secret was starting to take over. A full-blown heroin addiction that was about to send his career off the rails, smash his public image to bits, and eventually drag him down a dark path involving violence, captivity, and, you guessed it, prison. Born George Allen O'Dowd back in 1961, Boy George came up in the vibrant scene of the London underground. He exploded onto the London club scene of the late 70s and early 80s with a look that was completely his own. A wild mashup of masculine and feminine, rocking dreadlocks, ribbons, and a full face of makeup, all of which made him pretty hard to miss. When Culture Club got together, their mix of pop, soul, and reggae, all fronted by George's buttery smooth voice, was an absolute knockout. Their first album went ballistic worldwide in 1982, and for the next few years, you could argue they were the biggest band on the planet. George was inescapable. On every magazine cover, every talk show, his face practically lived on MTV. He was clever, sharp, and seemed to handle the insane pressure of fame with total class, famously joking, "I'd rather have a cup of tea than sex," building this image that was flashy but somehow totally harmless. But the pressure was unreal, and George started looking for an escape in all the wrong places. I mean, how long could he really keep that act up? By the mid-1980s, the whispers about Boy George's heroin habit started to get a lot louder. His behavior went off the rails. He'd blow off interviews, cancel gigs, and that famously vibrant look of his started to get, well, washed out. The signs of his habit were becoming obvious, and the band began to splinter, which wasn't helped by the seriously messy, secret love affair between George and the drummer, John Moss. In 1986, the whole perfect picture finally came crashing down. George's own younger brother went to the papers, pleading with them to expose George's heroin addiction, figuring it was the only way to force him into rehab. The story became a tabloid goldmine. Not long after, the cops raided George's London home and popped him for heroin possession. Around that same time, Michael Rudetsky, a keyboard player who had written a song with George, was found dead from a heroin overdose right there in George's house. Now, George wasn't directly tied to Rudetsky's death, but the whole thing just poured gasoline on the media fire. Culture Club was done, and Boy George, once the Prince of Pop, became a walking cautionary tale. He spent the next few years bouncing in and out of rehab, trying to launch a solo career with, let's say, mixed results. He stayed famous, often praised for just sticking around. He killed it as a DJ and even launched a hit musical, Taboo, based on his own crazy life. It really seemed for a while like he had finally conquered his demons. He was clean, creative, and for all intents and purposes, stable. But the thing about addiction is it casts a long shadow, and in the mid-2000s, George's life took another dark, violent, and completely out of left field turn, which led to the crime that would finally get him sent to prison. So, what could have possibly dragged him back down? In April 2007, a guy named Auden Carlson, a Norwegian male model and escort, called the cops claiming he'd been attacked and held hostage by Boy George in his London apartment. Carlson said that after a totally normal photo shoot, George convinced him to come back a second time. On this visit, Carlson claimed George and another guy accused him of messing with George's laptop, then handcuffed him to a fixture on the wall. Then, he said they put him through a terrifying ordeal where George threatened him and beat him with a metal chain. Carlson somehow managed to rip the fixture clean out of the wall and escaped into the street, half naked and terrified, where he got the police involved. When the officers got there, they found the handcuffs still attached to the wall. Boy George was arrested, and the case went to trial in late 2008. George absolutely denied the whole thing, claiming Carlson was just trying to extort him and had been trying to steal photos from his computer. His defense team argued the handcuffing was just part of a consensual hookup that went sideways. Problem was, Carlson's testimony was really convincing, and the evidence backed up his story of being held prisoner. The prosecutors pointed to George's history of drug abuse, suggesting that maybe some cocaine-fueled paranoia was what led to the attack. The jury had to figure it out. Was this a kinky sex-gone-wrong situation, or a violent assault fueled by paranoia and control? In January 2009, the jury made its call. Boy George was found guilty of assault and false imprisonment. The judge, sentencing him to 15 months in the slammer, absolutely tore into him. The sheer violence and humiliation that Carlson was put through. The sight of Boy George, the ultimate flamboyant pop star, being carted off to Pentonville prison was a spectacular fall from grace. He did 4 months before getting out early on good behavior, though he was slapped with a strict curfew and an electronic monitor. Since getting out, Boy George has pretty much pieced his life and career back together. He's jumped in on culture club reunions and even popped up as a coach on talent shows and kept his successful DJ career spinning. He's still a very outspoken and, for the most part, beloved public figure, however. His prison time serves as a harsh reminder of that dark phase, when addiction and paranoia drove him to commit an act of violence totally at odds with the gentle, soulful image that first charmed the world. He wasn't thrown in the slammer for simple possession, but for the brutal consequences. That his long-term substance abuse finally uncorked a familiar pattern of addiction leading to jail time, which we saw in another British pop star whose personal battles unfolded even more theatrically for all to see. Number 3. George Michael. He was the absolute picture of cool sophistication with his smoldering good looks. With that buttery smooth voice and those perfectly engineered pop hits, George Michael basically wrote the manual on superstardom for a whole generation, starting with the pure, bubbly energy of Wham! And rocketing all the way to the global tidal wave that was his solo album, Faith. We're talking over 100 million records sold and a boatload of awards, and he carefully built this image of total control and artistic genius. The guy was private, hard to pin down, but always gave off this vibe of untouchable, smooth confidence. But, of course, behind that signature designer stubble and those unforgettable tunes, George Michael was in a knockdown, drag-out fight with some serious personal demons. Grief, depression, and a budding romance with certain substances. A relationship that would spiral into a string of very public, very dangerous moments, finally hitting a climax with a wild car crash that actually put the pop legend in jail. Born Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou back in 1963, George Michael exploded onto the music scene as one half of that insanely popular duo, Wham! Jams like Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go turned them into worldwide teen heartthrobs, but Michael had his sights set way higher. So, in 1987, he dropped his solo debut, Faith. And that album wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural earthquake, moving over 25 million copies and cementing his reputation as both a serious artist and an international sex symbol. He seemed to handle the fame effortlessly, micromanaging his public image and guarding his private life like a fortress, especially when it came to his sexuality. The man seemed untouchable, a master of his craft at the absolute top of his game. But a couple of personal tragedies were about to blow his perfectly curated world all to pieces. So, what kind of darkness was hiding under all that pop perfection? Well, the 1990s delivered huge professional wins, but they also dealt him some devastating personal blows. In 1993, his first true love, Anselmo Felipe, passed away tragically from a brain hemorrhage related to AIDS. Then, just a couple of years after that, his beloved mother lost her battle with cancer. Michael himself later called this a time of deep, dark depression and grief. And it was right around then that his use of certain party favors mostly weed, but also supposedly prescription pills, and eventually, some heavier stuff, began to seriously escalate. He openly admitted that he used these things to numb the pain and get away from the crushing pressure of being famous. His first big public faceplant happened in 1998, when he got busted for getting a little too friendly in a public bathroom in Beverly Hills, an incident that basically forced him to come out of the closet. Super embarrassing for sure, but hey, at least no illicit substances were involved that time. But the shenanigans that came next would put his substance use front and center for the whole world to see over the next 10 years. George Michael's driving skills, or lack thereof, started to become a scary, recurring theme that pointed to much bigger problems. Back in 2006, he was found passed out at the wheel of his Mercedes in London, just sitting there blocking an intersection. He copped to driving while impaired by a cocktail of weed and prescription meds, and promptly had his license taken away. But just a few months later, despite that driving ban, he was found half-conscious in his car yet again, which earned him a nice little stint of community service. Then, in 2008, he was picked up in a public restroom for holding crack cocaine and marijuana, though they ended up dropping the charges. A year later, in 2009, he smashed his Land Rover into a truck. It was starting to look like a clear pattern of close calls, all powered by his ongoing recreational habits. His friends were worried. The tabloids were having a field day with juicy headlines, but the superstar just couldn't seem to hit the brakes on his own self-destruction. The whole world was watching, basically waiting for the train wreck, and it finally happened in the middle of the night in July of 2010. In the wee hours of July 4th, 2010, people in Hampstead, North London, were jolted awake by a massive crash. It was George Michael, driving his Range Rover all over the road, fresh from a gay pride parade, when he completely lost control and slammed his SUV straight into the front of a photo shop called Snappy Snaps, demolishing the storefront. The cops showed up to find him looking dazed and confused, slumped over the steering wheel. He was promptly arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence. Subsequent blood tests confirmed he had marijuana in his system and had also popped some prescription anti-anxiety meds. Yeah, this was definitely not just another slap on the wrist. This was a serious, potentially deadly crash right in a residential neighborhood. That picture of the pop star's fancy car buried in the front of a local shop became the perfect, grim snapshot of his downfall. So, how was the legal system going to handle it this time? When George Michael showed up in court that September in 2010, he pleaded guilty to driving under the influence of drugs and to possession of cannabis. Naturally, his lawyers pushed for a lighter sentence, bringing up all his charity work and his well-documented personal problems. But the judge was not playing around, pointing to Michael's past driving offenses and the clear and present danger of what he did. The judge made it clear that his addiction and fame weren't a get-out-of-jail-free card, stating, "It does not appear that you took proper steps to deal with what is clearly an addiction," the judge declared. To the absolute shock of just about everyone, George Michael was sentenced to 8 weeks in the clink, plus a fine and a 5-year driving ban. The sophisticated superstar was headed to the big house. He served 4 weeks of his sentence at High Point Prison before being released. The whole experience, he later mentioned, was horrible, but he did take responsibility for his actions. After his release, he tried to get his act together by checking into rehab and talking more openly about his fights with addiction and depression. He continued to perform here and there, but his health was always on shaky ground. On Christmas Day of 2016, George Michael died unexpectedly at his home at the age of 53 from heart and liver disease, conditions that were likely made much worse by his years of substance abuse. His prison sentence for that drug-fueled driving incident is a truly sad low point in a career marked by unbelievable highs. He wasn't jailed for pushing product, but for the dangerous fallout from his own personal use, a cycle tragically well known to our next star, whose bad boy reputation was cemented by countless drug-fueled arrests and jail stints. Number 4. Bobby Brown. He was the original bad boy of R&B, the electrifying showman who bolted from the wholesome boy band in New Edition and just exploded onto the solo scene with an undeniable swagger, cranking out chart-topping hits like My Prerogative and Don't Be Cruel. Bobby Brown basically defined the sound and style of New Jack Swing, mixing that R&B smoothness with pure hip-hop energy. His marriage to pop royalty, Whitney Houston, formed a superstar power couple whose every single move was put under a microscope by the entire world, but underneath the goofy hats, the Gumby haircut, and that magnetic stage presence, Brown was wrestling with some major demons. A brutal addiction to alcohol and cocaine that powered a life of pure chaos, drama at home, and a seemingly bottomless list of arrests that kept landing him back in jail, eventually overshadowing his massive musical talent. Born in 1969, Bobby Brown got his first taste of fame at a young age as a founding member of New Edition, but his rebellious side didn't quite jive with the group's squeaky clean image, leading to his exit in 1985. His solo career then took off like a rocket with the 1988 album Don't Be Cruel. It was a multi-platinum monster that turned him into a global superstar. He was young, rich, famous, and just oozing with charisma. His marriage to Whitney Houston in 1992 looked like a fairy tale, but that fairy tale quickly spiraled into a notoriously explosive and public train wreck, heavily fueled by both of their escalating substance issues. Cocaine, crack, and alcohol became the main event in their turbulent lives, and Brown's bad boy persona started becoming his real life with frightening regularity. So, how long could he possibly keep his superstar status while everything else was a complete dumpster fire? Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Bobby Brown's name was a regular feature in two very different places: the music charts and the police blotters. And his arrests became so common, you could practically set your watch by them, painting a rather messy picture of a man just spiraling. The charges were a real grab bag of bad decisions, but they usually had one thing in common: his extracurricular activities. You had your classic DUIs, a little something for drug possession, we're talking cocaine and marijuana and battery, often tied to some very public domestic drama, including incidents with Whitney Houston. And to top it all off, countless probation violations. He seemed to have a season pass for the legal system's revolving door of arrests, court dates, quick trips to rehab, and short-term jail stays. Each new incident just chipped away another piece of his career and public image. The electrifying performer was being totally upstaged by the chaotic addict. You had to wonder, was he ever going to get off this merry-go-round? His commitment to drunk driving was particularly impressive. Racking up multiple DUI arrests across different states became his signature move. Then, in 1996, he faced battery charges after a little nightclub disagreement. In 2000, he did a little time in the clink for an old warrant that decided to say hello. Then, in 2003, he was sentenced to more jail time down in Georgia for, you guessed it, violating probation. A probation violation that was, of course, related to a previous DUI. He was then arrested again later that same year for battery against Whitney Houston just to keep things interesting. The cycle was brutal and predictable. First came the arrest, then a court date, usually followed by a quick stint in jail or probation, which was inevitably followed by another violation or a brand new charge. His complete inability to follow court orders or just stay clean meant that even small-time offenses would often blow up into serious jail time thanks to probation violations. His addiction and his legal problems were two sides of the same coin. Charges for cocaine possession just kept popping up. He was never shy about admitting his heavy drug use during his marriage to Houston, painting a picture of a deeply codependent relationship where substance abuse was just part of the daily routine. And while Whitney Houston's heartbreaking death in 2012 put their shared history of addiction back under the microscope, Brown's own run-ins with the law didn't miss a beat. He racked up more DUI arrests in 2012, which earned him another court-ordered trip to rehab. Every single arrest, every new mugshot, just hammered home this public image of him not as a music pioneer, but as a deeply troubled addict, unable to outrun his own demons or the fallout from his actions. Unlike some stars whose substance use leads to one massive crime and a long prison sentence, Bobby Brown's jail time was more like a revolving door of short, disruptive stays. He served countless short bids, days or weeks at a time, mostly in county lockup, almost always for violating probation, because he just couldn't stay sober or follow the court's rules, tied to his DUI and drug possession charges. While none of the sentences were particularly long on their own, the combined impact was absolutely crushing. These constant trips to jail torpedoed any shot at a career comeback, wrecked his relationships, and just solidified the public's view of him as unreliable and totally out of control. The guy's talent was off the charts, but his addictions and the legal drama that came with them were like an anchor constantly dragging him down. In more recent years, Bobby Brown has opened up about his struggles, his fight for sobriety, and the incredible grief he felt after the tragic deaths of both Whitney Houston and their daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, who fought her own battle with addiction. He has since admitted the massive price he paid for his drug use, on his career, and on his family. His journey is a grim reminder of how addiction can trap someone in a never-ending cycle of self-destruction and jail time, even for someone blessed with world-class talent. He wasn't locked up for being some drug lord. It was his own personal use, and the chaotic behavior it sparked, that kept him tangled up in the justice system for decades, a tragic cycle that's all too familiar for our next star, whose poetic words were no match for the grip of heroin and the British tabloids. Number 5. Pete Doherty. In the early 2000s, British rock and roll crowned a new king of chaos, complete with skinny ties, trilby hats, romantic lyrics, and this vibe of beautiful self-destruction. Pete Doherty, the frontman for the Libertines and later Baby Shambles, became a full-blown icon. He was the poster boy for cool Britannia indie rock. Talented, charismatic, cool without even trying. And it really looked like he was destined for greatness. The music critics couldn't get enough of him, and the fans absolutely idolized him, while the tabloids followed his every move with a kind of twisted delight. But here's the thing. Doherty wasn't just dipping his toes in the rock and roll lifestyle. He was drowning in it. His incredible talent got completely tangled up with a nasty, very public, and non-stop addiction to heroin and crack cocaine, an addiction that turned him from a rock star into a walking, talking headline, leading to a dizzying merry-go-round of arrests, failed rehab attempts, and multiple trips to prison. Born in 1979, Pete Doherty's rise to fame was like a rocket ship. He and Carl Barat started the Libertines in the late 90s, and their raw energy, poetic lyrics, and explosive chemistry immediately captivated the entire UK music scene. Their debut album, Up the Bracket, was instantly praised as a modern masterpiece. Doherty was hailed as the voice of a generation, a sensitive soul hiding inside a punk rocker's body. He carefully crafted this image of romantic ruin, taking cues from old poets and living a life that seemed to mimic their own troubled brilliance. But that romance faded fast, as Doherty's drug use spun completely out of control. Heroin and crack cocaine became his two best friends, and for a while, they even seemed to fuel his creativity, but was also absolutely wrecking his relationships and his reliability. His addiction became the main drama for the Libertines, leading to a whole lot of canceled gigs, constant infighting, and eventually his first major brush with the law, which hilariously involved his own bandmate. Could the band even survive his nosedive in 2003? So get this. While the Libertines were off touring Japan without him, thanks to his epic unreliability, a desperate and strung-out Doherty broke into Carl Barat's apartment. He then stole guitars and other valuables, presumably to pawn for some quick cash for his habit. And, spoiler alert, he was arrested. He pleaded guilty to burglary and was handed a 6-month prison sentence. This little act of betrayal against his closest partner in crime stunned the entire music world and triggered the first official implosion of the Libertines. He served about 2 months before getting out and, incredibly, briefly reuniting with Barat. But the giant, untreated addiction in the room was still there. This prison sentence wasn't just for possession, it was for a seriously boneheaded crime. A crime committed solely because he was desperate to fund his habit. So, you'd think this first taste of the big house would be enough to scare him straight, right? Not even close. After the Libertines finally crashed and burned for good, Doherty just started a new band, Baby Shambles, and somehow, the music was still getting critical praise. Meanwhile, his life became an even more spectacular public train wreck of addiction and chaos. The British tabloids became completely obsessed with him, especially during his wild, high-profile relationship with supermodel Kate Moss. Every arrest, every court appearance, every rumored overdose was splashed right across the front page. Doherty became less of a musician and more of a walking caricature of the drug-addled rock star. His rap sheet started growing exponentially. Getting busted for possession of heroin, crack cocaine, cannabis, and ketamine became just another Tuesday. On top of that, the driving offenses were piling up, like driving without a license, without insurance, and often while not exactly in a state to operate heavy machinery. He was basically caught in a perpetual loop. Score some stuff, get arrested, go to court, get a fine or probation, violate that probation, and get arrested all over again. His court appearances became these bizarre media circuses. He'd show up late, looking like he'd been sleeping in a dumpster, and sometimes even allegedly brought his party favors into the courthouse with him. Judges were getting visibly frustrated, throwing everything at him. Fines, community service orders, driving bans, and mandatory rehab vacations. Doherty would graciously attend rehab, sometimes for a whole few days, before checking out, relapsing immediately, and starting the whole cycle over again. He seemed completely incapable of escaping the grip of his addiction, no matter how much legal trouble was piling up on his doorstep. In 2008, he served 29 days of a 14-week sentence for breaching probation tied to his previous drug and driving shenanigans. Prison just seemed to be a temporary, forced sobriety stop before he went right back to his old habits. You have to ask, would any sentence be long enough to make a difference? His addiction didn't just lead to possession charges. it was fueling other creative criminal endeavors. Besides the burglary of Bharat's apartment, he also faced accusations of robbery and blackmail in other incidents. Even though he dodged a few legal bullets, the never-ending circus around him wasn't exactly a victimless crime. A few folks in his circle ended up checking out early from party-related mishaps, including filmmaker Robin Whitehead, who was ironically filming a documentary on Doherty's life when she cashed in her chips from a heroin overdose in 2010. Now, legally, his hands were clean, but these deaths really put a spotlight on the sketchy world his habits had built. His biggest stint behind bars just for holding came in 2011, after the cops found some marching powder on him following the investigation into Whitehead's death. He copped a plea and got a 6-month stay in the slammer. Pete Doherty's whole saga is a textbook example of how a nasty habit can completely swallow even the most brilliant artist's whole. I mean, his music was all about love, sticking it to the man, and that classic, gloomy English vibe, but his actual life turned into this public, never-ending brawl with heroin and crack. He basically had a revolving door policy with the local jail, mostly for getting caught with stuff, a little 5-finger discount to pay for his hobby, and of course, telling his probation officer to take a hike. All because he just couldn't seem to kick his habits or follow the court's simple rules. Unlike some celebs whose crimes were one-and-done violent acts, Doherty's dance with the justice system was a total, slow-motion train wreck, a never-ending cycle of screw-ups, fueled by the relentless grip of addiction. He has supposedly gotten clean for stretches in recent years, getting away from the wild London scene, but his legacy is still a tangled mess, a truly brilliant songwriter, whose massive potential was always being sabotaged by his personal demons, a guy whose visits to the slammer became almost as common as his visits to the stage. Now, while Doherty's jail time was all about his all-consuming personal party favors, our next star's trip to the big house came after a completely bonkers, drug-fueled police chase involving firearms, a truly shocking public flameout for the hardest-working man in show business. Number 6, James Brown. He wasn't just a singer, he was an American institution, the Godfather of Soul, the hardest-working man in show business. Soul brother number 1. James Brown was a musical titan, an absolutely electrifying performer whose raw power and groundbreaking rhythms and legendary stage presence completely reshaped American music. From funk and soul all the way to hip-hop, his influence is just off the charts. He was a symbol of black pride, a self-made icon who preached discipline and self-respect. But behind that incredible talent, the dazzling footwork, and the tightly polished public image, James Brown was fighting some major demons, a hair-trigger temper, a history of drama at home, and especially in his later years, a destructive relationship with PCP, angel dust, and cocaine. This addiction would set the stage for one of the most bizarre and jaw-dropping public meltdowns in music history, which climaxed in a high-speed, 2-state police chase and a prison sentence that absolutely floored the world. Born into extreme poverty in rural South Carolina in 1933, James Brown's early life was a constant struggle. Music was his ticket out. He clawed his way up the ranks, first with the famous Flames and then as a solo act, dropping hit after hit. Papa's got a brand new bag. I got you, I feel good. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. His live shows were the stuff of legend. He demanded nothing less than perfection, ruling his musical empire with an iron fist. He was a complicated guy, a champion of civil rights, a savvy businessman, but also known for being a control freak with a seriously explosive temper. And while rumors about his drug use had been swirling for years, it was in the 1980s that his substance abuse, especially with PCP, seemed to go completely off the rails, leading to some increasingly wild behavior. So what finally pushed the Godfather over the edge? The breaking point hit in September of 1988, and it all kicked off in the weirdest way possible at an insurance seminar next to his office building in Augusta, Georgia. Brown, supposedly high as a kite on PCP, got ticked off that someone had used his private bathroom. So he burst into the seminar waving a shotgun and a handgun. He started screaming at everyone to get out, just ranting like a madman. The police were called, but before they got there, Brown peeled out in his pickup truck. What happened next was a totally surreal, hour-long, high-speed chase that crossed the state line from Georgia into South Carolina and then back again. Cops were chasing the legendary singer as he swerved all over the road, driving over curbs and even ramming into police cars. He was finally cornered back in Augusta after the police shot out his tires. He climbed out of the truck, defiant but clearly out of his mind. The hardest-working man in show business was under arrest. So, what was with the guns and the desperate escape? Brown later claimed the whole thing started because of threats against his life, and that he was afraid for his safety. But his drug use was pretty hard to deny. He was charged with a laundry list of felonies, including aggravated assault on police officers, carrying weapons, and drug offenses. And yep, PCP was found in his system. His trial was an absolute media circus. James Brown, the icon, was looking at serious time behind bars. His defense team argued his actions were just the result of drug-induced paranoia. The prosecutors, on the other hand, painted him as a dangerous, a totally out-of-control figure. So, in December of 1988, James Brown got slapped with a guilty verdict on a few charges, including aggravated assault and, my personal favorite, refusing to pull over for the cops. The judge handed him a 6-year sentence in a South Carolina state pen. Seeing the legendary James Brown in cuffs? Yeah, that was a real jaw-dropper. He started his time at the State Park Correctional Center before he got bumped to a work-release program. Word on the street is that prison had a major effect on him. He even got into some counseling programs. After doing a little under 3 years, James Brown walked out on parole in February 1991. And what's the first thing he did? He tried to stage a massive comeback, of course, desperate to get his crown back. Now, while he never hit those superstar heights again, James Brown kept touring like a man possessed, right up until he passed away on Christmas Day, 2006. That whole 1988 arrest and prison stint, it's still a seriously wild chapter in an absolutely unbelievable life story. That was the moment his famous ironclad control just completely shattered, blown to bits by a nasty PCP addiction. He didn't go down for running some massive drug ring or anything, but for the wild, paranoid stuff his own habit unleashed during that legendary car chase. And while Brown's little drug-fueled public meltdown was a heck of a show, our next guy's struggle with addiction was a much sneakier beast. A ghost that haunted his whole career and led to a revolving door of arrests and jail time, all thanks to heroin. Coming in at number 7, Scott Weiland. The whole 1990s grunge and alt-rock explosion gave us a ton of legendary frontmen, the voices that basically became the soundtrack for a whole generation's angst. But not many of them had the totally magnetic, snake-like charisma of Scott Weiland. As the frontman for Stone Temple Pilots and then Velvet Revolver, the guy owned the stage with this slinky, hypnotic grace and a voice that could go from a gravelly roar to a smooth, seductive whisper in a heartbeat. He was the poster child for a rock star, mysterious, super stylish, and just dripping with raw talent. But, and it's a big but, his entire career, from the insane highs to the tragic finish, was stalked by a brutal, decades-long heroin addiction. And this wasn't just some inspiration for his dark lyrics. It created a non-stop cycle of arrests, failed rehab stints, and jail time that torpedoed his bands over and over again, and, in the end, played a huge part in his early death. Born Scott Richard Klein back in 1967, Weiland got together with some guys to form Stone Temple Pilots, or STP, back in the late 1980s. Their first album, Core, dropped in 1992 and was a monster, multi-platinum hit driven by massive singles like Plush and Creep. Their next album, Purple, came out of the gate at number 1, locking STP in as one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. It looked like Weiland was on top of the world, but while the band was busy conquering the charts, he was sinking deeper and deeper into the clutches of heroin. His habit pretty soon became a core part of his whole rock star image, and, just as fast, it started getting him on the radar of the police. So, how long could he keep that train from going off the rails? Weiland's first big drug bust went down in 1995. He got nabbed trying to buy crack cocaine, but the real demon on his back was heroin. He ended up with a felony conviction for heroin possession and got sentenced to probation with the condition that he had to finish a rehab program. This arrest basically kicked off a pattern that would become his signature move: get busted, go to rehab, usually because a judge made him stay clean for a hot minute, relapse, and then get busted all over again. His addiction was just a constant chaotic mess for Stone Temple Pilots. Tours got scrapped, recording sessions went sideways. All that incredible potential the band had was constantly being sabotaged by the fact their lead singer just couldn't stay off the stuff. So, you think this first run-in with the law would be a wake-up call? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The cycle just kept on spinning through the late 1990s. More heroin possession arrests started piling up. Violating his probation basically became a hobby. Then, in 1999, after blowing off probation one too many times, Weiland was looking at his first serious time behind bars. He got sentenced to 1 year in the Los Angeles County Jail. This was a pretty hefty sentence, meant to be a serious shock to his system. He did several months in a special drug treatment unit right there inside the jail before they let him out early to a live-in rehab center. And all this time, STP was pretty much forced to just press pause. When he got out, Weiland seemed like he was really ready to turn things around. He got back with STP, they put out the album Number 4, but Staying Clean? Yeah, that was still a whole nother story. By 2001, he was back in legal hot water, this time for some drama on the home front. Stone Temple Pilots, completely fed up with the never-ending circus, finally called it quits in 2003. You'd think Weiland's career was toast, but rock and roll, being the forgiving beast it is, gave him another shot by letting him form a supergroup. He teamed up with some old Guns N' Roses guys to create Velvet Revolver. The band was a massive hit right out of the gate, climbing all the way to the top, and Weiland even looked like he had his act together. But, spoiler alert, the pressure got to him. His old pals' bad habits came knocking. By 2007, he got busted for driving while on his personal party pack. His behavior got more and more bizarre, and his little slip-ups started causing major friction, looking suspiciously like a repeat of the exact same issues that blew up STP. So, in 2008, Velvet Revolver basically said, "We're breaking up with Scott Weiland." It was like watching a rerun, and the rest of Weiland's career followed a depressingly predictable script. He even had a brief reunion with STP, just so they could have the satisfaction of firing him again in 2013. He tried going solo, but his stage shows became a total roll of the dice because you never knew which version of him was going to show up, clearly thanks to his extracurricular activities. And of course, more arrests piled on, including another joyride gone wrong and charges for carrying his party favors. Now, these later busts didn't land him in the slammer for long, but they kept the revolving door spinning. He just served these little weekend getaways in jail for not following the rules. The grand total was a career full of pit stops and wasted potential. The ride finally ended on December 3rd, 2015, when Scott Weiland was found out cold on his tour bus. The cause? An accidental cocktail of cocaine, booze, and MDA. He was only 48. His whole story is one of those classic rock and roll tragedies, a guy with a killer voice who got eaten alive by his heroin habit. All his arrests and jail time weren't for hurting people, just for holding and being under the influence of the very stuff that eventually took him out. It was this sad, constant background noise to the awesome music he gave millions of people. While Weiland's habits just got him a bunch of short stays in the county lockup, our next star's recreational choices fueled a story that was way longer, messier, and more violent, ending with some serious hard time. Number 8. DMX. You see, some artists get famous with shiny, perfect pop songs. Others just grab you by the throat with something raw, totally unfiltered, animal energy. Earl Simmons, the guy the world knew as DMX, was definitely that second one. This man didn't just rap, he barked. He growled. He prayed. He cried. He basically just dumped his entire tormented soul onto every single track, with an intensity that was somehow both scary as hell and impossible to turn away from. He blew up on the late 90s hip-hop scene like a hurricane, pulling off some insane chart success with 5 #1 albums in a row. His music was dark, it was in your face, and surprisingly spiritual, all mirroring a life that was just one big mess of hardship and internal battles. But and here's the twist you saw coming, the very same demons that made his art so powerful, the rough childhood, the paranoia, and a nasty, lifelong affair with crack cocaine were also the ones that led him right down a path of non-stop self-sabotage, resulting in a rap sheet so long it's almost comical, with arrests, probation, no-shows, and long stretches in prison that kept hitting the mute button on one of the most unique voices in rap. Born in 1970, Earl Simmons grew up in Yonkers, New York, which for him was basically a masterclass in poverty, abuse, and being ignored. On top of that, he had terrible bronchial asthma. The story goes, he was tricked into smoking a joint laced with crack cocaine by some older guy he looked up to when he was just 14, an event he swore lit the fuse on a lifelong addiction. His teen years were spent bouncing in and out of group homes and juvie halls, with hip-hop being his only real outlet. And man, the guy had talent, you couldn't deny it. After years of sharpening his claws, DMX got signed by Def Jam Recordings, and in 1998, he dropped his debut album, It's Dark and Hell is Hot. The thing was an absolute monster, critically and commercially, landing at #1 right away, a trick he'd pull off with his next 4 albums, which was just unheard of. Hits like Rough Riders Anthem, Party Up, Up in Here, and X Gon Give It to Ya became the soundtrack for everything, showing off his signature mix of hardcore aggression with this weirdly vulnerable side. He wasn't just a rapper, he was a full-blown event, but all the money and fame in the world couldn't build a cage strong enough for his personal demons, and pretty soon the cops came knocking. I mean, almost the second he became a superstar, DMX's legal troubles kicked off. It's like for every hit record, he had a hit on his record. His rap sheet grew into a ridiculously long saga of run-ins with the law that crisscrossed the country for decades. The man's alleged crimes were all over the map, but if you followed the breadcrumbs, most of them led back to his very public and very messy battle with crack cocaine. Not to mention the wild, paranoid antics that came with it. Getting popped for drug possession was practically a hobby. He was constantly getting pinched for holding cocaine, marijuana, and all the gear that goes with it. The courts would give him probation, and he'd treat it like a suggestion he had no intention of following. Which, surprise, led to warrants and more time in the slammer. His addiction also turned him into a menace behind the wheel, racking up multiple charges for driving while blitzed, cruising on a suspended license, and generally just being a public hazard, which explains some of the truly bizarre episodes, like plowing through an airport gate or, pretending to be a Fed. It seemed like the chaos from his addiction made following any rule, any law, completely out of the question. You had to wonder, how many get-out-of-jail-free cards did this guy have? But his unpredictable behavior eventually led to some really heavy charges. He caught a lot of heat for animal cruelty, stemming from the awful conditions found on his properties, where they found a bunch of neglected pit bulls. On top of that, he was busted for theft, vandalism, causing a scene, and of course fighting the cops during the arrest. And this wasn't a one-time thing. He even had weapons charges thrown at him. Every single arrest was a tabloid feeding frenzy, trashing his reputation and putting his career on ice. Gigs got scrapped. Hollywood stopped calling. The music started to trickle out instead of flow, even though nobody could deny the man still had that raw, undeniable talent. He was just too much of a wild card, a walking legal disaster that nobody wanted to bet on. For most celebrities, a prison stint is a one-and-done chapter, but for DMX, it was more like a chronic illness, a revolving door of getting out just long enough to get himself thrown right back in. You just had to wonder when the judge was going to finally throw the book at him. His sentences started small, just short stays in the county lockup for ignoring his probation, but they slowly climbed up to serious time in state and federal pens. One of his bigger vacations from society started back in 2008 when he was looking at a heap of trouble in Arizona, including drug possession, theft, and that animal cruelty case, all after he decided to hole up in his house during a full-blown SWAT raid. He finally copped a plea and got sentenced to do time in a state prison. But true to form, he got out only to get himself arrested almost immediately after. The reason? Violating probation by getting high. It was the same old story, on repeat. Then in 2010, it was another year in the can for, you guessed it, probation violations back in Arizona. Fast forward to 2015, and he did a few months in New York because he wasn't paying his child support. But his biggest federal case came down the pike later. And it wasn't just about the drugs, it was about the absolute financial train wreck his lifestyle had become. In 2017, Uncle Sam came knocking. DMX was hit with federal tax fraud charges, accused of dodging about $1.7 million in taxes over the years, using some shady scheme with cash and hidden accounts. The prosecutors basically said he was pulling these financial shenanigans to keep his expensive, drug-fueled party going. Staring down some serious federal time, he pleaded guilty. At his sentencing in 2018, the judge actually gave a nod to all the trauma and hardship Earl Simmons had been through his whole life, and even played his gut-wrenching song, Slippin', right there in the courtroom. DMX broke down, talking about his demons, and how he just wanted to be a better dad. But hey, sympathy doesn't make tax fraud disappear. The crime was serious, and he got sentenced to 1 year in a federal pen. And even that wasn't the final chapter. After getting out in 2019, he promptly blew his parole by testing positive for cocaine, which earned him a mandatory trip back to rehab. The cycle just seemed tragically, ridiculously unbreakable. DMX was always upfront about it, in his songs and in interviews, calling his addiction a straight-up war he fought every single day. He never painted crack cocaine as some fun party favor, but as a personal demon that gave him a quick escape before plunging him into an even deeper hell. That brutal honesty about his pain really hit home with a lot of his fans, who could see the tortured artist hiding behind all those crazy headlines. In the end, DMX passed away on April 9th, 2021, at just 50 years old, after a devastating heart attack. Kicked off by a cocaine overdose, his passing led to a huge wave of public mourning. You could say his life story is one of the biggest bummers in modern music history. The guy had a one-of-a-kind voice, made it big against all odds, but just couldn't shake the demon that latched onto him when he was just a kid. His rap sheet was a mile long, mostly for possession, ghosting his PO. Some creative accounting tied to his lifestyle, and just the general mayhem his addiction cooked up, and it all stands as a brutal reminder of the lifelong damage that crack cocaine can do. And while DMX's addiction led him on a merry-go-round of crime, our next guy's heroin habit fueled a much quieter, but just as messy pattern of arrests and jail time that kept tripping up his rock and roll fantasy. Number 9. Ike Turner. This dude was a trailblazer, a visionary, a straight-up musical hurricane whose blistering guitar licks and genius arrangements basically built the foundation for rock and roll. Before Elvis, before Little Richard, there was Ike Turner, fronting his Kings of Rhythm and, you could argue, cutting the very first real rock and roll track, Rocket 88, way back in 1951. His team-up with Tina Turner created one of the most explosive duos in music history, just a pure tornado of raw R&B, power, and soul. But here's the kicker. Ike Turner's insane musical talent was tragically tangled up with a dark, violent, and super-controlling side, which was gassed up for decades by a monster crack cocaine habit, while his abuse of Tina became the horrifying main story of his later years. And it was his own non-stop drug use that eventually sent him spiraling into paranoia, a boatload of legal problems, and a pretty hefty prison sentence, slapping a pretty grim final chapter onto a legendary career. He was born Azir Luster Turner Jr. back in 1931 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Ike Turner was basically a musical genius from the get-go. By the time he was a late teen, he was already a band leader, an arranger, and a talent scout, a major player in the booming Memphis music scene. His discovery of a young Annie Mae Bullock, who he famously renamed Tina Turner and later married, shot him right back into the national spotlight in the 1960s. The Ike and Tina Turner Revue turned into a total powerhouse, famous for their insane live shows and hits like Proud Mary. Ike was the brains of the operation, the tough-as-nails bandleader, while Tina was the spellbinding voice front and center. But backstage, their relationship was a complete horror show. Ike's need for control came out as straight-up brutal physical and mental abuse, a story Tina would, of course, later blow the lid on. And throwing gasoline on that fire, especially over the years, was Ike's spiraling drug addiction. You gotta wonder, how long could that train wreck keep rolling? Now, Ike Turner probably dabbled in all sorts of stuff during his career, but his nosedive into a serious crack cocaine addiction in the late 1970s and 1980s happened right around the time his partnership with Tina blew up, and his music career took a serious hit right after she walked out on him in 1976. She left with nothing but her name and slowly started building her solo career, which, let's be honest, eventually left his in the dust. Ike, on the other hand, was completely adrift. His music career had totally tanked, and he was getting way too deep into a very expensive habit. A habit that was allegedly draining his bank account and cranking his already legendary temper and paranoia up to 11. He just sort of floated through the 1980s, a ghost from a whole other era of rock and roll. His musical genius was getting buried under an avalanche of stories about his abusive behavior and his out-of-control substance use. Before long, the arrests started stacking up. You had to wonder, how long could the music legend keep dodging a major fallout? His rap sheet was getting longer than a CVS receipt, mostly for your classic combo of illegal powders and firearms. He got busted for cocaine possession more times than anyone could keep track of. Yeah, this wasn't just a weekend thing anymore. It was basically his entire life. The few people still around described a guy completely lost in paranoia, liable to snap at any moment, and his house had reportedly become a chaotic 24/7 party zone. He did a few short stints in the slammer for some of this, but it was just a revolving door. At the same time, his reputation in the music industry was taking a nosedive. While Tina Turner was selling out stadiums across the globe, Ike Turner was becoming the poster child for how not to live your life. Then, in 1989, the hammer finally came down for good. So, what was the final nail in the coffin for his freedom? After getting busted yet again for coke and some driving shenanigans, Ike Turner, now in his late 50s, was looking at some serious hard time. His rap sheet for drug busts was a mile long, and his total failure to kick the habit wasn't doing him any favors. He got convicted and slapped with a 4-year sentence in a California state pen. And we're not talking a weekend in the county lockup. This was the real deal, a major sentence. The courts basically said, look, your addiction has been going on for decades. You're officially a career criminal. The sight of a rock and roll founding father, a guy who literally helped create the genre, getting locked up for cocaine was a pretty shocking end to his long, slow-motion train wreck. Ike Turner ended up doing about 18 months of his 4-year sentence before getting paroled in 1991. And in a twist you just can't make up, he got out just days before he and Tina Turner were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Naturally, Ike, fresh out of the joint, couldn't exactly make it to the ceremony. But prison, ironically enough, did seem to force him into a little sobriety. When he got out, he swore up and down he'd kicked his coke habit for good and tried to stage another musical comeback, dropping some albums that got decent reviews, and even snagged a Grammy for Best Traditional Blues Album in 2007, right before he died. He also put out an autobiography, trying to push back on Tina's side of the story and polish up his own musical legacy. While pretty much nobody bought his denials of the abuse, Ike Turner passed away in December of 2007 at the age of 76 from a cocaine overdose, a tragic but, let's be honest, maybe predictable ending considering his lifelong struggle. His whole story is a complicated and often ugly mess. The guy was, no doubt about it, a musical trailblazer, but you can't separate his genius from his violent streak and his addiction. And while what he did to Tina Turner is still the main thing people remember, that major prison sentence back in 1989 was a straight shot from his own crippling, decades-long addiction to the hard stuff. That was the moment the law finally cornered a guy whose life had careened from the highest peaks of music down into the gutter of drug addiction. An addiction that also powered the strange finale of our next pop star. Number 10. Flavor Flav. A guy whose whole public image, giant clock and everything, seemed like one big joke, way more than just a hype man's timepiece. You know, in the pop culture universe, some people get famous not just for what they can do, but for who they are, just pure, uncut personality. They're those larger-than-life characters, the ones you know instantly from their catchphrases, their look, and their totally out-there quirks. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, there was this one guy armed with giant clocks, wild sunglasses, and that unforgettable yeah boy, who somehow became the unforgettable face of one of the most game-changing groups in music history. That man was Flavor Flav, the ultimate hype man for the politically charged rap juggernaut, Public Enemy. His energy was off the charts, his whole act was comedy gold, but behind that huge clock and that goofy grin, a decades-long war with a brutal addiction was raging a fight with crack cocaine that kept landing him not on a stage but in a jail cell. Born William Jonathan Drayton Jr. in 1959, Flavor Flav's road to fame was anything but typical. He hooked up with Chuck D in college, and the two of them became the core of Public Enemy, a group that would completely rewrite the rules of hip-hop with its heavy beats and radical political lyrics. Now, while Chuck D was the group's lyrical powerhouse, Flav was the wild card, the court jester. He wasn't the lead MC, but his ad-libs and his impossible-to-ignore stage presence with that clock always hanging there to symbolize their urgent message became a key part of the group's whole identity. Smash hits like Fight the Power and 911 is a Joke were absolute anthems, and Flav was right in the middle of it all, the court jester in the kingdom of a musical revolution. But while Public Enemy's star was shooting into the stratosphere, Drayton's personal life was spiraling into the gutter. So what was the demon hiding behind that playful mask? That demon had a name: crack cocaine. Flav got hooked bad, starting a severe addiction that would haunt him for decades, wrecking his career and constantly threatening to take away his freedom. The hilarious irony is that while Public Enemy was preaching discipline, Flav's own behavior was going completely off the rails, creating some serious tension. His habit eventually led to his first real run-in with the law. And yeah, it was directly tied to his extracurricular activities and a short temper. Back in 1991, he copped to assaulting his girlfriend at the time and got a 30-day stay in jail for it. But why stop there? Just 2 years later, in 1993, his addiction decided to up the ante with an even crazier incident. This time, he was charged with attempted murder and possession of a weapon. The story goes, he allegedly started shooting at his neighbor over some kind of argument. This little episode, combined with his ongoing substance issues, pretty much got him excommunicated from Public Enemy. For a good chunk of the 90s, he was a regular on the rehab circuit, but the grip of his addiction was just relentless. His legal troubles just kept piling up, creating a rap sheet that read like a greatest hits of bad choices, possession charges, domestic disputes, and a whole lot of driving no-nos. So, was this guy ever going to break the cycle? Just when it looked like his music career was totally cooked, Flavor Flav staged the most unlikely, massive comeback in the 2000s. He did it through reality TV shows like VH1's The Surreal Life, Strange Love, and especially his own ridiculously successful dating show, Flavor of Love, which introduced him to a whole new audience. He blew up into a pop culture phenomenon all over again, with people loving his completely bizarre antics and his televised quest for a soulmate. The shows were, of course, torn apart by critics, but you can't argue with the fact that they made Flavor Flav a household name again. It seemed like he'd found a new way to turn his chaotic energy into entertainment. But the big question was, had he really beaten the addiction that had haunted him for so long? Sadly, the reality TV fame was no match for his demons, and while the cameras were rolling on his comedy act, his struggles with addiction were raging off-screen, leading to, you guessed it, more arrests and legal drama. He started racking up charges for his adventures behind the wheel. This included driving with a suspended license. And on a more serious note, the domestic violence problems continued. In 2012, he was arrested in Las Vegas. It was after a domestic blow-up with his fiancée, where he allegedly threatened her teenage son with a knife. This little incident landed him some felony charges. He eventually pled guilty to some reduced misdemeanor charges, which got him probation. His rap sheet just kept on growing, a stark reminder that the goofy guy on TV was still battling some very serious issues, almost always connected to his substance abuse. His prison sentences were often pretty short, all things considered. Especially compared to the other folks on this list, his time was usually for probation violations because he just couldn't stay clean. Or he'd failed to follow court orders related to his driving or domestic charges. It wasn't like there was one single, major crime. He never got a multi-year sentence for being a drug kingpin. It was more like a constant, annoying pattern of short-term lockups that kept derailing his life and career. For example, failing drug tests while on probation or just not bothering to show up for court dates for his various offenses. That kind of stuff would often get him a warrant and some jail time, but we're talking weeks or months, not years. The cumulative effect, though, was massive, showing a life constantly being put on hold by the fallout from his addiction. Flavor Flav's story is a wild mix of revolutionary music, comedic genius, reality TV absurdity, and the absolutely devastating, decades-long fallout of a crack cocaine addiction. He wasn't locked up for being some criminal mastermind. Instead, his own personal use repeatedly led him to violence, reckless behavior, and little trips to jail that shattered his relationship with one of the most important groups in hip-hop, and it constantly threatened to completely overshadow his undeniable impact on the culture. His journey is a masterclass in how even what seems like minor drug-related offenses, when you keep doing them because of addiction, can lead to a life on the installment plan with the local jail. It's a revolving door, and the thing pushing it is the very substance the guy just can't get away from.